Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Maryland Native Plant Society's webinar, Gardening for Pollinators with Kerry Wixted from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. Maryland Native Plant Society is an all-volunteer organization, and the webinars are put on with all-volunteer effort. If you can make a donation in any amount when you register to support our programs, we very much appreciate that. Our speaker tonight, Kerry Wixted, is the Education and Outreach Specialist from the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. She runs 2 statewide programs, actually probably many more. One is Wild Acres for backyard wildlife enthusiasts, and also a project for educators statewide. I have been lucky enough to be out in the field with her, and I can tell you that she is amazingly knowledgeable, not only about plants, but about all aspects of the natural world. And she's also a very gifted educator and communicator. So, Kerry, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be here tonight and to talk about gardening for pollinators. So welcome to Gardening for Pollinators. Good evening. I'm so glad that you're here. My name again is Kerry Wixted, and I work with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources within the Wildlife and Heritage Service. So we manage the state's wildlife resources, the ducks and the bucks and everything else in between, including our pollinators. And so this is one of the fun presentations that I like to talk about. And this is also part of our Wild Acres Backyard Wildlife Habitat Program. So if you enjoy this, check out our Wild Acres because we have a lot of links and resources on how to help wildlife in your own backyard. So the world of pollination is varied and diverse, and animal pollinators have closely evolved with plants over thousands and sometimes even millions of years. And so pictured here, just a small sampling of different groups of pollinators that you might see here in Maryland. So our only pollinator that has a backbone are ruby-throated hummingbirds. Certainly bees are some of our best pollinators because they're super hairy. We have flies that help with pollination. We have ants, wasps help pollinate. We have some moths that pollinate, they're beetles, and all sorts of other different organisms that assist with that pollination. And when you look closely at the flowers, sometimes you can guess who's supposed to be the pollinator based on the characteristics that it's using to attract those pollinators. And this is what we call pollination syndrome. So you can look at the color or the scents of the flowers, the shapes, and when they bloom and determine who is supposed to be the primary pollinator. For example, in tropical areas, sometimes bats are pollinators. And so bats help pollinate plants like agave, and that gives us tequila. So it has, it blooms at night and it has those white flowers, and it is attractive to bats. We don't have any bats as pollinators here in Maryland, but we have plenty of other organisms that assist with pollination, including things like flies that often are going after plants that are pale or dull to dark brown or purple and stinky. So think about things like pawpaws and flowers like the skunk cabbage. Those are often pollinated by flies. And then, of course, the things that aren't pollinated by animals don't have to put any energy into that color or that scent or showy flowers, because essentially all of their energy is going into producing as much pollen as possible. So these are typically the plants that we are allergic to because the pollen is getting dumped into the air, and anything that is pollinated by these animals, people typically don't have allergies to. So let's test your knowledge really quick. Try out some quiz really quick. So look right here. You see this red tubular flower, Bbomb. And who do you think is supposed to pollinate this one with those long tubular flowers and reddish in color? It's one of my favorite summer plants. You can type that in the chat and I'll see that. Good. I'm seeing some hummingbirds there. So yes, anything that is red or tubular in shape and or orange in color, that usually is an indication that it's pollinated by our hummingbirds here in Maryland. Now let's look over here at our goldenrods. We have a lot of different goldenrods here in the state, some that bloom early in the spring and some that are summer, and we even have some that bloom in the fall. So looking at the color and the shape of those flowers and all of that, think about who might be the primary pollinator for these. Seeing bees and flies, bees and butterflies. Bees, yes. Good job. So yes, goldenrod is often accused of causing fall allergies because it's blooming in the fall when a lot of people are sniffling and sneezing. But in fact, its pollen is too heavy to be transported by the wind and get lodged up in your nose. So it needs to put energy into resources to attract things like bees and wasps to be able to move that pollen from one plant to another. So excellent job there. And as I said, bees are some of our best pollinators because of their super hairy bodies. And here in Maryland, we have over 430 species of bees here in the state. So we have a tremendous amount of bee diversity. And just last week was World Bee Day. So hopefully you got to celebrate that. In the world of bees, we have two main groups based on behaviors, nesting behaviors. We have our solitary bees, and then we have our social bees. So the social bees are the ones that live in these colonies, and they have division of labor, and they usually have a queen or somebody who's in charge, and everybody's helping together to form up the colony and take care of the young or go out and forage and things like that. So a lot of times the social ones get more aggressive around their nests because they've got a lot more to lose. In contrast, most of our bees here in Maryland are actually solitary. And that means after mating, the females are essentially single moms. And so she has to go and find and build a nest. She has to provision it with food, and then she has to lay her eggs all by herself in her short life cycle. And so I often joke that she ain't got time to sting you because she really has a lot to do in a little bit of time. So the majority of our bees here in Maryland are solitary, they're non-aggressive, and they're super important for a lot of the pollination that happens, particularly with our wildflowers and our native trees and all of that. So in the world of solitary bees and also in the world of social bees, some of them nest in the ground and then some also nest in tubes and tunnels. And in Maryland, about 70% of our bees nest in the ground. So that's a large majority of them. And so here are just a few of our ground nesting species. Earlier in the spring, you might have seen these cute little spring beauty bees flying around. They often have pink pollen pants because, as their name suggests, they primarily visit spring beauty. So they have a very special relationship between the spring beauty and that bee. And so this is a relationship that's also fragile because the loss of either the bee or the flower can be detrimental for the other. So they have that specialized relationship. In contrast, we've got other bees like the squash bee. So squash bees are nesting in the ground. And for those of you who have vegetable gardens, this is a great friend to you for anything in that cucumber family. And so squashes and pumpkins and sometimes cucumbers, they will help with pollination. So squash bees are specialized to a family of plants, but they have a much larger diversity of plants that they will visit. So they're really tiny too, and sometimes the males will actually snooze in the flowers overnight. So if you look inside the flowers, if you open them up gently in the morning while they're still closed, sometimes you'll get a brief look at that little male sleeping inside. It's always something fun whenever I'm growing squash flowers to do. And then you might have had, if you had sandy soil and large colonies of ground nesters, you might have had some of these plasterer bees or some of their relatives that were out nesting earlier in the spring. Most of our ground nesting species are only active for a few weeks at a time, and we have some that are active in the spring, and then some in the summer, and then some a little bit later in the growing season. Unfortunately, despite their importance for helping with pollinating plants and giving us and other organisms lots of food, essentially we're seeing large-scale declines of insects, including our pollinators across the world, not just here in Maryland. And so this is a very big problem for many of us, and not just for the foods that we eat, because almost like 1 in 3 foods that we eat are thanks to pollinators, but also think about the birds and the mammals and other organisms that eat those pollinators as part of the food webs. So it's important to have that diversity and support that diversity if we want to have a healthy ecosystem. And the great thing about pollinators is that you don't need a very large area to be able to support and help them. So this is one wonderful thing about pollinators. If you just have a very small backyard or maybe a porch, putting something out that is native that will help flower and support them with either nectar or nesting sites can be really, really important for our pollinators compared to some of our larger species, which might need acres and acres of land to be able to support. So the things that I'm going to go over tonight include planting native plant species that are going to be able to assist with nectar and pollen for different pollinators here in Maryland, as well as thinking about using those native plants for nests and nursery sites. I'm also going to talk about removing invasive species, and invasive species are non-native species that cause problems. And so, for example, a very popular thing is butterfly bush, which is attractive to butterflies, but it's important to know that attracting is not the same thing as supporting. So just because the butterflies go to the butterfly bush does not mean it's supporting its life cycle. And I always say this is kind of like, or actually my coworker, Paula Becker, always says this is kind of like putting a Coke machine in a high school. Of course, the kids are going to flock to the sugary substitute, but it's not going to support their growth and their development. And that's the same thing with butterfly bush. It's super sugary in terms of its nectar, but it doesn't have the right minerals needed for reproduction, and it doesn't support a nursery habitat for any of our local butterflies and moths. So it's not something that is going to be supporting these species in the long run. In addition to removing those invasive plants, I'm going to talk about just a few things to help create and enhance habitats with some different practices that you will be able to employ to help provide shelter and other resources for those pollinators. So the first thing with designing your pollinator habitat or any type of wild habitat is just knowing your goals. And so essentially this is so important. So do you want to attract butterflies? Do you want to attract bees? Are you looking to help a particular species in your area? So what are your goals? Are you like me and you just want to bring everybody to your yard? That's kind of my goal there. My husband isn't as excited about that, but I love wildlife and I love to welcome everything into my yard. So knowing your goals is a very important first step and thinking about how you're going to achieve them. And the second step is knowing your habitat. What size of the area are you going to be able to plant? What's the sun like? What's the soil like? So thinking about things like soil pH and the makeup of the soil. Is it sandy? Is it clayey? Is it kind of a mixture like a loam? Does it stay wet for a long amount of time? That's all important because that's going to factor into what types of plants are going to be able to thrive in your habitat. And it's important to know that in some of our habitats, the way that our areas have been developed, our front yards and our backyards and our side yards can have different soil chemistry and different sun exposures and all of that. For example, this is an older picture of my front yard before I started tackling most of this periwinkle. But my front yard's mostly shaded and it has wonderful soil, great soil up front, holds some moisture and all of that. But in the back of my yard, the developers scraped off all that topsoil and I got left with all that solid Maryland clay and it's in full sun. So it gets baked out in the sun. So what I plant in my front yard is very different than what I can plant in my backyard. And that's just something that you have to be aware of with your habitats, what these little microclimates that might be in your yard. So you're going to have the best chances of success with these plants that you're going to put out. So another thing that's going to factor into the success of the plants that you put out is your location here in Maryland. So, and if you're not in Maryland, you can always look up your physiographic province in other states as well. But here are the physiographic provinces across Maryland, and these are based on factors such as climate and geology in these different areas. So I live in Anne Arundel County, which is part of the coastal plain. And so I've got mostly sandy and acidic soils and all of that. And it's warmer here than where I went to college and learned all of my plants up in the Ridge and Valley province and the Appalachian Plateau province. So when I moved down to the coastal plain, I was trying to plant a lot of these things that I was so familiar with from the mountain region, but they weren't working because it was just too warm and the soil wasn't right. And now there are certain plants that will grow across the state, but there are some plants that are going to be specialized to the different regions of Maryland. One really helpful resource that's linked in the Wakelet is this native plant guide from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. This is a really excellent guide, and it also links up to the nativeplantcenter.net website. And essentially, you can go in there and you can look, at least on the website, you can use drop-down boxes and say, I'm on the coastal plain, I have sunny soil, and I have this I want a shrub, and it will tell you the different native plants that you can plant in that area, give you different suggestions and all of that. So nativeplantcenter.net is the same thing as this book. It's just a website. So you can also access this book as a PDF online. And another resource that I like to use too is the Maryland Biodiversity Project. So this is a local nonprofit that also looks at distributions of plants across the state. And so I like to look there and just see if these things are native to my area as well, because the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service site kind of looks at broader areas across the state. So I just wanted to make sure that this plant, before I put it in my garden, is found in Anne Arundel County, just so I'm supporting my local species, because that's my goal, is to really replicate some of the habitat that I have in my yard with some of the local forests and all of that. So this plant in particular, Golden Alexanders, is a beautiful spring flowering plant, and it's actually the host plant for black swallowtail butterflies. And so I put some out in my yard last year, and they started using that instead of the non-native dill that I normally plant for them. So that was pretty exciting to have them do that switch all of a sudden. A few other things to consider before I start talking about suggestions for different plants. But my big suggestion is to start small and see what works for you in your habitat and in your different microclimates. And I see a question from Janice about dealing with large areas of invasive weeds and plants. And yes, it can be super overwhelming. I've been working on periwinkle in my yard for 10 years now, but I'm almost at the point, I've got one tiny patch left that really I just need to devote a day to, and then I'm going to be done and have a big party and celebration. So start small and take out areas that you can work on and have success with. And the other thing with starting small, plant small amounts of certain plants. Like when I put those Golden Alexanders out, I only bought 3 for the first time because I didn't want to invest a lot of money and find out they weren't going to work in my microhabitat, in my soil. Because even sometimes when I do all the research and that's supposed to work in my habitat, something is missing from my soil that causes some of those plants to fail. So start small, and then once you find what works, what does really well in terms of growing or removing those invasive plants, then start replicating that and expanding. If you really want to help pollinators too, another thing to think about is varying up the bloom times. So essentially having blooms that are going to offer food in the spring, in the summer, and the fall. And for a lot of our pollinators, early spring plants and late fall plants are the limiting factors, particularly for things like monarch butterflies. Having late fall nectar sources is super important for the Atlantic coastal plain population of our monarchs. If you want to help certain species like monarch butterflies or other butterflies, consider planting for the life cycle. So not just the plants that the adults are going to feed off of, but think about those plants that are hosts, which are going to be the nursery plants for the butterfly caterpillars. And I'll show you a list of those different plants on one of my next slides. And that's also linked in the Wakelet as well. My final suggestion is to be careful with cultivars. So cultivars are plants that have been selectively bred for human characteristics. So it could be that they are more resistant to powdery mildew, or they bloom longer, or they can grow in a different type of habitat. And so sometimes with native plants, they call cultivars nativars. And you'll see with these nativars and cultivars, it will have the name like Bbomb and then X and then the cultivar name after it. So it might be something like Wild Bergamot X Claire Grace. And that's telling you that that's the Claire Grace cultivar of that species. So there's a lot of things that we do not know, and some cultivars may actually be better for animals than straight species. But just a cautionary tale from Dr. Annie White's PhD thesis looked at cardinal flower, lobelia, and essentially this is our cardinal flower. It's a beautiful plant that blooms this time of year in wetlands, but it can be kind of hard to grow. And so essentially one of the cultivars was a cross with it, and I think grape blue lobelia. And so if you look at this, it's got denser flowers and bigger flowers. And in Dr. White's studies, this actually attracted more hummingbirds. They were coming to this over this because it was bigger and showier. But when Dr. White looked at the nectar content, it had 80% less nectar than the straight species. So this goes back to the attracting doesn't always mean that it's supporting. The hummingbirds were spending more time visiting these cultivars, but getting less food in the process. Do all cultivars have less pollen and nectar? We don't know. There could actually be some that have more pollen and nectar, but there's a lot more that we need to do in terms of studying these species and to understand. And the other thing is the cross-pollination with our native straight species out in the wild. What could those cultivars have in terms of impacts on our local wild plants? That's another factor to consider, and something we still don't know fully. So in some cases, cultivars are all that are out there, and a native cultivar is better than a non-native plant any day, and it's certainly better than an invasive plant. So do the best that you can with the tools that you have. That's my biggest suggestion there. So as I was mentioning, one of the documents that I have on the Wakelet is our butterfly checklist to Maryland, and it has most of the butterfly species in Maryland, as well as the plants that they typically visit via as adults, and then the plants that they often lay their eggs on as and their caterpillars feed on. So some of these include non-native plants, and some of these species are generalists, so they're going to go to those non-native plants, and some of them are also non-native butterflies that might have co-evolved with those plants. So just look down the list, and you might be able to find some species that will be helpful to plant to attract certain butterflies in your yard if you're interested in them, particularly like some of the showier species. A lot of people are really interested in the swallowtails just because they're big and they're showy. Another thing to consider with planting for the life cycle is that a lot of these plant-insect relationships have evolved over a very long time. And essentially, our native plants have co-evolved with our native insects, and they have special relationships. And here's some of research from Dr. Doug Tallamy over in Delaware. You might have seen some of his work. He does some great talks, and he's got some excellent research. And this is from some of his earlier research looking at the number of butterfly and moth species that lay their eggs or host on different woody plants. These are the top 5 native woody plants, and these are the top 5 non-native woody plants. And if you look at the oak there, over 530 species of butterflies and moth use the oaks, so in the Quercus genus there, compared to something like the pears where it's only 138, which is still a lot, but that's only 20% of what an oak would be able to support. And this research, when I first saw it years ago, it just blew my mind because I never thought of trees like oaks and cherries as butterfly plants, but they certainly are. And if there's one thing that you can plant out in your yard that if you have the space for it, there's only one thing you can plant, put out an oak or a cherry. But understand that these plants are really attractive to a lot of things that are going to eat them. So if you don't want that plant to be eaten, then don't put that plant out there, or at least don't put it out in your front yard as like a focal tree species or something like that, because you're going to bring those insects in and they're going to be feasting on it. And then the birds are going to come in too, and they're going to feast on all those insects as well. So let's start talking about some different types of nectar plants. And again, these really depend on your environment and your goals and what you want to attract. But I tried to select some that are pretty easy to find and also easy to grow and not often eaten by deer. So those were kind of some of my reasons for my picks. One of my first picks is common blue violet. This is a native ground cover. A lot of people are really interested in ground covers. And for me, common blue violet grew wild in my backyard, like out in the lawn. So my husband saw it as a weed and I was like, oh no, this is the host plant for fritillary butterflies. And so I started digging it up and putting it in my butterfly garden and then also putting it out front. And sure enough, we got fritillaries. So I very, very rarely see the adults, but I find the caterpillars and the chrysalises in my yard. So they're telling me that the reproduction is happening with that common blue violet. It's easy to grow. It grows in full sun, full shade. It can spread really, really well, sometimes too well in some areas, and it's easy to transplant too. So maybe find somebody who has some common blue violet and get some to put in your yard if you're looking for a spring ground cover. Another great ground cover plant is golden ragwort. So this is a semi-evergreen plant, and this can be really aggressive in the right situation. So I planted this in my front yard after it had taken over my friend's backyard, and I was really hoping for it to just go wild. And this is where the microclimates really matter, because my golden ragwort patch in my yard is very well behaved compared to his yard in Baltimore City. And so, you know, it really depends on how your soil is and how it's going to act, but it's doing really well. And it's a great resource for a lot of our local bees and some of our solitary wasps that also like to visit it. And so it's finishing up seeding right now, but it gives you a nice pop of color in the spring if you would like that. If you have shady areas and moist soil, wild geranium is another wonderful plant. This is a beautiful purple plant. I see sweat bees on it very often, and then also a lot of the flower flies that are often utilizing it. So this likes shady areas and also a little bit wetter soils, not like wet as in wetland soils, but just moist and not super dry soils. Columbine is also another spring. This is a late spring bloomer, and this likes part shade. This is an excellent hummingbird plant. So as I was mentioning earlier, those red tubular shaped flowers. So if you want to bring in hummingbirds and you're like me and have mostly shade, then this is a great plant to put out there. It also hosts several species of leaf miners, little moths and things like that, that actually make these little cute tunnels in the leaves. And I've actually seen some of the birds picking at those leaves to get those leaf miners out. So it's feeding the pollinators and the birds all together there. Some spring nectar plants that are woody, you know, a lot of people talk about dandelions being the first food source for our bees, but it's actually things like red maples. This is the first food source for our native bees, and this is the first native food source that's out there. So red maple is really important. It's a tree that's going to grow all across Maryland, and it is a gorgeous tree. So it's a great one to put out in your landscape. If you want to support some of our specialist bees, those that have those special relationships with certain plants, and you have an area that you're okay with a woody plant spreading in that's a little wet, black willow or another willow species would be a good choice. So willow, you have to be really careful with because willows love water and you don't want to plant it anywhere near your house or your pipes or anything like that. And it can have sometimes a scraggly growth habit. But if you've got a lower lying section of your yard that gets kind of wet, or you live by a wetland or something like that, and you're looking for a plant to help bees in the spring, then willows are an excellent choice in that regard. We also have a number of viburnums here in Maryland. And so some of the viburnums, like maple leaf viburnum right here, is a small shrub. So this gets 3 to 5 feet tall and has these beautiful clusters of white flowers this time of year. And then we have some others like the cherry leaf viburnum, and this gets taller. So this is more of a small tree. So we have different types of viburnums. So no matter what habitat you have out there, there's a viburnum for you. Just make sure it's one of our native viburnums, because there are some non-native viburnums like the linden viburnum that's starting to spread in places like Montgomery County and really become a problem. Most of the viburnums are deer resistant, except for our little maple leaf viburnum. This is what I planted in my yard, and the deer did find it, so I have to have mine caged up. But I planted this just because I know I have local maple leaf viburnum in the local woods, and I just wanted to have a continuation of that habitat, essentially. So check out resources to look at and see if there's a viburnum out there for you. And they're excellent plants to put out there. The only other caveat that I will say about viburnums, if you're out in Garrett or Allegheny County, you might not want to plant a viburnum, because we do have viburnum leaf beetles that do quite a bit of damage to them. But if you're willing to take it on, this is an excellent plant. Not only is it a nectar plant and a pollen source, but in the fall, it has these juicy berries that are filled with fat and protein that help migrating birds. So lots of benefits there. Moving on to some summer native plants, I like to choose the native mints because these are easy to find and super easy to grow. So Bbomb and wild bergamot and spotted Bbomb are all called monardas. They're in the monarda genus. So Bbomb likes little wetter soil, and this is that hummingbird plant. Wild bergamot likes drier soil. So this is what I've got in my backyard in the sunshine. And this is a lot more attractive to bumblebees and solitary wasps, those that are just like the solitary bees, they don't got time to sting you. But the solitary wasps are great at pest control, not just with pollinating, but also helping with some of your garden pests. So it does double duty if you put that plant out there. If you have really dry soils or maybe even sandy soils in full sun, spotted Bbomb is lovely. And it's just such a pretty little plant. So all of these plants will self-seed in different areas and spread. But if they start to spread in an area that you don't want them to be in, they're very easy to pull up and manage. In contrast, mountain mint is also a mint, but this is in the Pycnanthium genus. And there's several types of mountain mints here in Maryland. And these are huge pollinator plants. They came out #1 in some of the Penn State trials with attracting the most types and numbers of pollinators. And I have to say, I don't know why I waited so long to put mountain mint in my yard, because it is just so much fun to watch the butterflies and the bees and the wasp and the flies and all sorts of things. Like, it just sounds like it's alive when it's blooming. And then it has these really cool looking seed heads once it goes to seed. So mountain mint will spread, and it has tougher root systems, so it takes a little bit more to control. So, but if you're up for the challenge, then that is an excellent plant. A few more summer plants, liatris. This is a lovely perennial, which I think is underutilized in a lot of backyard gardens. So this is one of those solitary wasps. This is a thread-waisted wasp in my own backyard, and they help to eat caterpillars and things like that that might be eating some of your plants. So I can't tell them what species of caterpillars to eat, but it's all part of that circle of life there. So liatris loves crappy soils. So if you remember me saying that I have that clay that's totally baked in my backyard, Liatris will thrive in it. And Liatris has been doing really good with the lack of rain that we've had the last few weeks, whereas some of my other plants in my backyard are kind of looking a little unhappy about not getting a lot of water. So if you've got nice soil, don't put Liatris out there. But if you've got crappy sun-baked soil, Liatris is great. And it comes from almost like a bulb-like appendage in it. It's really easy to find and grow. And then also when it goes to seed, the goldfinches love it too. So another double duty plant. Sweet pepperbush is an excellent plant for the coastal plain. It will be blooming very soon. So this is a shrub. It smells wonderful. It's gorgeous. And my only complaint about it is that it doesn't bloom long enough. So I have some in my backyard that grows wild, and it is a magnet for butterflies. So sometimes I suggest this as a substitute for butterfly bush. Even though it doesn't bring in a number of butterflies like butterfly bush, it actually is going to be supporting life cycles. Similar to sweet pepperbush, Joe pieweed also is another plant that is a good substitute for butterfly bush. And so this grows really tall and it likes slightly wet soils. There's a smaller species as well, but some of them can get 6 to 8 feet tall, and then they're covered with butterflies while they're flowering. And also, since it is in that aster family, much like the Liatris, those little seeds will also be good for a lot of our birds that are going to be passing by and needing that food to eat. And I see your question, Marianne, about sweet pepperbush. It might be able to thrive in Montgomery County. So I'd have to look. I think it will. So check out that U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service guide, and that might be able to help you with that. So finally, some fall nectar plants. I chose all asters for the fall because a lot of our asters are very easy to grow, easy to maintain, and most of the time deer leave them alone. So these are bone set or late flowering bone set and just regular bone set. They are excellent plants to put out in the garden for late fall sources. Those goldenrods, so not all goldenrods are fall goldenrods, but there are some species that are fall blooming, and we've got a lot of goldenrods. So if you have shade or you have full sun, you've got wet soils or dry soils, just like there's a viburnum for you, there's a goldenrod out there for you. Now, some of the later blooming goldenrods can be pretty aggressive, like some of the Canada goldenrods. And I've gotten some that have seeded in my yard for free. And I'm like, oh, free plants. But I have to work every year to make it so it doesn't take over my entire backyard, which secretly I would be okay with, but my husband would not be okay with. So we got to keep that balance there in the backyard with our different goals. So out front, I have some smaller goldenrods like blue-stemmed goldenrod and zigzag goldenrod, which bloom earlier in the summer, and they're a bit more well-behaved, but they grow in full shade. Whitewood aster is an excellent shade aster if you're like me and have lots of shade. So this one will self-seed and spread, and it also gets little leaf miners on it. And then things like the New England and New York asters will bring a pop of purple in the late summer and early fall. And sometimes these plants will actually even bloom into October. And so that can be really important for some of those really late monarchs that are passing through. So to help Julia out, I just saw your question about balconies and plants for pots. So here's a few plants that you can put in pots. Trumpet honeysuckle, if you've got the sun and you have an area that you can put a big enough pot and a trellis in, this is a lovely plant for hummingbirds. This is what I use instead of a hummingbird feeder because I don't like to clean hummingbird feeders as much as they're supposed to be cleaned. So I have trumpet honeysuckle, which all I have to do is water it occasionally. So this is a great plant, and you can actually take cuttings of it and use rooting hormone and root it that way. And it's starting to become a lot more popular in the nursery trade if you don't have a friend with trumpet honeysuckle who can share some with you. Some of the non-native herbs like dill and parsley and fennel and all of that, they're actually host plants for the black swallowtail. And so this is normally what I would grow. I would grow parsley and things like that for the black swallowtails until I switched to the golden Alexanders this year. But I will say they don't call them hungry caterpillars for nothing. So if you put those things out and you want some parsley for yourself, you really want to overplant, because sometimes those caterpillars will just knock it all down to the ground. And last couple of years, I've given up on growing parsley for myself. I just get mine from the grocery store or the farmer's market, and all the parsley I grow outside just for the butterflies, because that's just how I am. So salvias, there's scarlet salvias and others and all of that. These are usually pretty easy to find. They're annuals, but they seed into pots, and they can bring in a lot of bees and hummingbirds and everything. So if you don't have a lot of money or a lot of area or anything like that, or have limitations with finding native plants, this is a good alternative to have in your garden, at least to start off with too, to see if it's, growing plants is right for you. Some of the coneflowers, purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans can also be grown in pots. And if you want the benefits of mountain mint without all of the work of keeping it under control, then you can put mountain mint in a pot as well. And then another one of the resources that I have linked on the Wakelet is these plants for pest control. So as I mentioned with the wild bergamot, it brings in a lot of those solitary wasps that are also helping with the pollinator control. Pest control. So you can put these plants out there as essentially your natural insecticides, essentially. So check out that document for some of those resources there. And a few other resources. Maryland Native Plant Society, they not only host these amazing webinars, but they have a great list of native plant sales and native plant sellers. So it sometimes can be difficult to find places that sell native plants. And so they've made it very easy with their lists and all of that. And then also Howard County, their Bee City USA, essentially, they've put together some wonderful templates for pollinator gardens. So if you're like me and don't really have that design aspect, this is helpful because they've already picked plants and told you what types of habitats to put them in and how much to put out there. So that's another one of the resources. The Bee City from Howard County is linked in that Wakelet there. When you think about providing shelter, some of the things that nature does is, nature leaves things out there. So nature doesn't clean up the leaves in the fall. And so a lot of species, including our Baltimore checker spots, which is the Maryland state insect, some of them will overwinter under leaf litter. Luna moths, which aren't technically a pollinator, but they're a moth species, they overwinter under leaf litter. So if you leave that leaf litter out in the fall through early spring, you can keep that habitat, that overwintering habitat for a number of species. In terms of other things, wood piles, excellent for lots of wildlife, not just butterflies and bees, but other wildlife species too. So never put a wood pile within 10 feet of your foundation, because sometimes you will get unwanted visitors in your house due to that wood pile attracting them. But wood piles are great. This past winter, I helped my in-laws with their wood pile, and I kept getting yelled at because I was like, oh my gosh, look at this morning cloak, and look at this insect, and look at that. And it was just one of those chores that a biologist is bad at, because so many things were thriving in that wood pile over the winter. And that's naturally the habitat that they would use. So that's something to keep as a consideration. And if you also have sandy open soil like I do, keeping those areas open and encouraging those solitary nesting bees can also be wonderful. So if you look at this image right here, all of those holes are from individual females. And there's a picture of a female right here, flying right here. So each hole belongs to one female, and they often little prairie dog up and down in those holes. Even if you step over them, they are probably not going to sting you, but they're going to get upset because you're stopping their progress with filling up those holes. So when people see these things nesting in the ground, they often assume that they're going to be these aggressive pollinators like our yellow jackets. And so some of the differences between something, a social species like the yellow jackets and our ground nesting solitary bees, the fact that you see a number of holes like this right now, all those little holes is telling you that these are all from individuals. whereas a colonial species is going to have one major entrance where multiple individuals are going to be coming in and out. Another thing to pay attention to, these yellow jackets have that bright yellow and black coloration as a warning coloration to tell you to stay away. And compared to our ground nesting bees, which are not colorful at all, so they don't have to warn you to stay away. So just pay attention to those types of things. And some, some of our social wasps like yellow jackets and bald-faced hornets, they are important pollinators and predators, but they can be too aggressive if you get too close. So certainly take care of the nest early in the season before the colony gets going and gets started, so you don't have to have any of those conflicts with them. Some natural tunnel nesting sites for those bees that nest in tubes and tunnels. So snags, standing dead trees, if they're not a threat to people, pets, or property, leave them up. They're better than any bee house, bird house, or bat house you could ever put up. Fallen logs, just leaving them to rot. So things like this halictid sweat bee right here, they will overwinter in those fallen logs, and some will even nest in that rotting wood. Soft woody branches, we call them pithy branches. They're helpful. Things like raspberry canes and stuff like that can be an overwintering site. And then some of the plants, those wild bergamots and goldenrods and all of that, those stalks, leave them up from the fall through the winter through early spring until we get a nice streak of about 60-degree weather, because there are quite a few bee species that will actually overwinter in them. And if you're not sure if they're using them or have emerged or anything like that, the suggestion that I've been given is just to cut them down in early spring and lay them horizontally off to the side of your yard instead of throwing them out. But you want to do this in the spring and not in the fall, because in the fall, if they get moved too much before they get mature, that can be a problem for some of those tunnel nesting species. The other thing, the big elephant in the room, is limiting pesticide and fungicide use. So certainly there's some situations where you do have to use pesticides, but it's all about making the best choices and avoiding the broadcast and systemic use of some of these things. So I often try to encourage natural predators. So this is a flower fly or cyprid fly larvae munching down all those oleander aphids that you get all over milkweed. So, you bring in the flower flies and there's my pest control there. If you limit your lawn habitat, that's also going to limit the breeding grounds for pests like Japanese beetles and rose chafers. And it's also important to know that organic can still be toxic. So, horticultural vinegars and salts and stuff like that can still be detrimental. And so one of the resources that I have linked in the document is from Cornell, and it goes through different types of pesticides, both organic and synthetic, and some of the concerns and uses. Pick something that's best for your needs and it's going to have the least impact on your local pollinators. You can also help with pollinator research. So with organizations like Monarch Watch, you can start up a monarch way station in the fall. You can actually help tag monarchs. You can help with the integrated monarch monitoring program. If you see some bumblebees outside, you can take a picture of them and submit it to Bumblebee Watch. There's lots of these different things, and consider participating in National Pollinator Week at the end of June. So check out resources too, like the Xerxes Society. They have excellent science-based information about pollinators because there is some bad information out there. So I always try to suggest going towards those science organizations to get that good information. And there's lots of different resources. So again, on that Wakelet, there's a PDF of my slides so you can see some of these different reference materials. Dr. Heather Holm has these two great guides. She just came out with the WASP one this past winter, and the bee guide is amazing. So if you want to learn more about bees and wasps in your backyard, those are great resources. Here in our own backyard, we've got Dr. Michael Ropp with the University of Maryland Extension. So lots of great resources that are out there to learn more about our pollinators or ways to help them. And there is my contact information, which I will also put in the chat. And I will open up the floor to questions.
Okay, we've got lots of questions. Thank you, Kerry, for a wonderful presentation. And We'll just start working our way through the questions. The first one is, do any other bees pollinate the squash family besides the squash bee that you showed?
Yeah, so there are generalist species like honeybees that will assist with the pollination, but because the squash bees co-evolved with our North American squashes, they are much more efficient at pollinating and getting you to actually get fruits and things like that as a result. So certainly there are others that are going to be out there helping, but some of these specialist pollinators are going to be the best ones for the job.
The next question is, Frank would like to know, what do caddisflies pollinate?
Ooh, good question. I'm not sure about caddisflies if they help with pollination. So I know like some of the fungus flies and fungus gnats will help, and chocolate is pollinated by flies, but I'm not sure about caddisflies. So
And you mentioned the question about how to deal with a large area with invasive weeds and plants. The work seems overwhelming, especially if you're trying to stay organic. Anything else you'd like to say about that?
yeah, start small. And then when I was dealing with the invasive plants in my yard, I also looked at the ones that were going to be the worst at spreading outside my yard. So those that were either wind spread or spread by berries with the birds. So I took out the privets first and the burning bush first. And then I started working on those horizontal spreaders like the pachysandra and the periwinkle. So considering, how much these things are going to spread outside of your yard could also factor in how you tackle all of that. And get some friends and entice them over for a pull-in party, a garden party. So food is always a good motivator to get people out there, and food and drinks, and yeah, work together to tackle the problem.
Another question about your yard. What are you planting in place of your periwinkle?
Ah, good. So I'm not covering the yard with ground covers like the periwinkle. So periwinkle was the entire part of my front yard. And what was really neat was when I pulled up some of the periwinkle in some spots, there were May apples that were suppressed by the periwinkle that just all of a sudden, like I had a couple May apples in there, but when I pulled the periwinkle, all of a sudden I had this huge crop of May apples just pop up. It was just so cool. So I have the May apples, and I have different sections that I've been planting in. And this year, essentially what I've been doing is putting in more shrubs. So I'm trying to put more understory in my yard. So I don't just have ground covers and trees, but I've got different layers. So it's going to look much different from how it started.
Another question is, what is your opinion of hummingbird feeders, assuming that it's kept clean and that there's no red food coloring in the sugar solution? The questioner has a native garden, but is concerned that a hummingbird wouldn't get the extra nutrients found in nectar. The habitat around is full of non-natives. How does one deal with this?
Well, as long as you're taking care of your feeder, just keep it up. It's an extra food source. It's a high sugar content, right? And it also shows you that you have your hummingbirds around. So that's also something wonderful to experience. So yeah, keep it up. If you've got bird feeders and you keep them clean, then keep them up and keep them around. But really, those native plants are going to be the best. Not just for the nectar and the pollen, but for hummingbirds, they eat a lot of spiders and insects. So it's going to bring those spiders and insects in too. So it'll help with the full life cycle of your hummingbirds.
The next question has two words. Deer resistant, question mark.
Well, no plant is truly deer resistant because in my experience, deer will eat just about anything. I mean, I've had a deer come in my yard and eat milkweed the last couple years. And they're not supposed to, because it has that milky sap that's supposed to be toxic. So it really depends on your deer and the pellets of your deer. And this is another thing to kind of test out when you're planting stuff, what's going to work. So there are websites like New Jersey Extension has a really good website on deer resistant plants. They include both native, non-native, and others on their list. but it's a very extensive list, and it breaks it down by ones that get hit hard by deer and ones that are least likely to be eaten by deer. So,
Okay, best we can hope for.
yes.
Which species of oak support the most insects?
Ooh, that's a good one. I'm not sure which one supports the most insects. I generally suggest planting things like white oaks just because the acorns are the most popular with our wildlife species. So white oaks might be a good bet for your habitat if you have those drier areas. And certainly it depends on your yard and what oak would work best for you based on how much space you have and the soil and everything.
You did address bee resources later, but someone would like to know if you have a bee checklist for Maryland.
I do not have a checklist that's similar to the butterfly list, but there's one resource that's really good that I'll add to the wakelet. I'll write that down. It's Jared Fowler's research for specialist bees of the Northeast. And so he looked at those bees like the spring beauty bee that specializes on certain flowers and what flower supports some of those specialist bees. So I'll add that to the wakelet, and then after tonight, you should have access to that.
We have a question about white and yellow violets. Are they also fritillary hosts in addition to the blue violets?
Yes, yes. So the fritillaries will go after different types of violets. So if you got white or yellow, then they'll also eat them. And I forgot to mention, there's a specialist bee, a violet bee, that uses violets as well.
What is the botanical name for golden ragwort?
It is, I think it's still Paccaria aurea. It's changed a lot. It used to be Senecio, and now it's Paccara. So
I think so too. Next question, when do hummingbirds migrate back to Maryland?
Oh, they're here. So they've been here for a few weeks. And there's actually, you could go to sites like Journey North and report your sightings for hummingbirds and also for monarchs as well. And so, yeah, you can go on there and see. And I think our first hummingbird showed up in late April this year. So we've got them around.
And the questioner says she saw one on her coral honeysuckle a week ago in Lutherville.
Oh, so exciting.
The next question is whether Bbomb is the same as Cardinal. I'm not quite sure what that means.
Oh, Bbomb is a different species. So Bbomb is a mint, and that is Monarda didyma. And cardinal flower is lobelia. So that's Lobelia cardinalis. I have to say, now that I don't work out in the field as much, some of my scientific names are rusty.
That's okay. Anne would like to know, she has liatris in a garden with very good soil. Does that account for the fact that they get very, very tall?
Oh, well, that's wonderful that it's doing well in your soil. So I've seen in some good soils, they flop over a lot, and that might be an issue in some areas. But the goldfinches will still eat it. The butterflies will still find it, even if it's not standing straight up. So if it's working well for you, then awesome. So I'm glad you have it too.
Now you've addressed pesticide use, but I'm going to relay this question because I think it's important. What are your thoughts on spraying for mosquitoes? The questioner says, I am increasingly planting natives and wonder how much damage the spray does to the pollinators.
That's the $1 million question. So at least in my area, it's the Maryland Department of Agriculture, MDA, that does the mosquito spraying in the neighborhood. So it depends on who does your neighborhood spraying, what they're using, at what time they're spraying it, and all sorts of different factors. So I know that in my area, MDA does make sure to spray in the evenings, and it's a very fine droplet to have the least amount of impact. It's supposed to make contact with night flying insects, like the night flying mosquitoes. The problem is that some of our pollinators are also active at night, and they can be negatively affected. So if you're in an area that has that county or state level spraying, you can opt out. And so they won't spray your property. And I think it's like a 300-foot buffer on either side. So that's something that I do. And then just working with my neighbors, like more of my neighbors are getting into the native plant gardening and ecological gardening. And I'm starting to see more of them also opt out of the spraying and try to focus more on removing the breeding habitats, essentially. So looking closer at where the water's pulling up and getting rid of that. And that's a big focus of some of MDA's programs too, is going into neighborhoods and addressing the concerns of where the breeding is happening, because that's much better than using all of the insecticides out there. So
please say something about golden Alexanders and poison parsnip. They look similar to the person asking the question.
Oh yeah, so it's the leaves. So golden Alexanders have these kind of round, almost heart-shaped leaves, and they're at the base. And then the stem leaves are little, whereas the other one is a lot more lacier leaves, and that grows and flowers at a different time. So golden Alexanders are basically done in most of Maryland. They might still be flowering in the mountain region and in cooler areas, but they're not going right now. And then the parsnip's going to be blooming like now and later.
What pollinates Mayapples and wild ginger?
Ooh, well, I know ginger. So ginger it's on the ground and it's ants and slugs. And I was looking at my plants this year, and there were all these little slug trails when I was taking photos of my flowers. So ants and slugs for wild ginger. And if you look at the coloration, it's that kind of like purplish, brownish too. So it might bring in some flies as well. For Mayapple, because it's that white bowl shape, I imagine beetles might be a primary pollinator just based on pollination syndromes and everything. But I have to say, I haven't really looked closely at who might be visiting Mayapples. So that's a nice one.
Marnie would like to know, the viburnum leaf beetle has been a problem in other parts of Maryland for quite a while, but we don't have them in the DMV. Will they move into our area?
I hope not. I mean, it's certainly possible. It's definitely very devastating out in Garrett County in certain times of the year. And I think that is a problem that the Maryland Department of Agriculture is working on actively to try to control. So I really hope that they're not going to take a stronghold in other parts of the state, because viburnums are a really important food source for a number of our wildlife species, not just pollinators.
We have a question about leaving the plant stems for bees. Can the tops of plants such as goldenrod be removed in the fall to avoid seed spread? How much stem do the bees need?
Yeah, if you just want to take off the top part, and not a lot of the stem, that actually will help the bees, because it'll make it easier for them to tunnel into some of those stems. So that definitely would work really well.
Another question about bees. Is it possible to be successful in distracting carpenter bees from drilling in a porch by providing carpenter bee tube houses?
This is a question that I've had some friends ask, and they put out some raw wood essentially, and the carpenter bees just went and used their deck anyways. So usually what I suggest for porches and other areas where you're having those carpenter bee issues, you should paint it or stain it. So they're using it because the wood is untreated, or it's been so long since it was treated that it's a nice habitat for them. So paint or stain will help out. And a lot of times the most damage happens in the fall when the woodpeckers find the caterpillar or the carpenter bee larvae, and they're the ones to drill it out. So I had no idea we had carpenter bees up in our soffits until the woodpeckers found them a few years ago. And there was like a pile of sawdust on my porch, and I was like, oh, look at that. So the woodpeckers can do quite a bit of damage there.
Do you know of any experiments specific to Maryland showing the difference between particular cultivars and straight species?
I don't know anything that's happened in Maryland. So I know Mount Cuba has been doing a lot of cultivar studies, but one of the things with their cultivar studies is they're just looking at attraction. So whether or not those bees or butterflies are coming to the flowers, not looking at nutrition, which takes a lot more effort and a lot more lab time, essentially. A lot of that stuff's very limited, and it's starting to happen more with PhD research projects and things like that, but I don't know of anything happening here at the state level.
Hess is asking, does everyone know that the pear you mentioned is invasive?
Oh, yeah, the Bradford pear is the invasive one, but we do have some natural pears as well that aren't invasive. And one of the reasons why Bradford pear has done so well in Maryland, it was supposed to be sterile, but it crossbred with our local pears, and that's how it was able to move all about. So
someone would like to know if we can attract the Baltimore checker spot back to Maryland.
That's a good one. And that's one that is much more difficult than with some of our other species. The problem with the Baltimore checker spot is that they don't fly very far from wherever they're born. And so that's one of the reasons why the populations have floundered, because if anything happens to the population and there isn't another area or another habitat for them to colonize, then they just they pass, they die. The other thing with Baltimore checker spots here in Maryland, based on some of our climate change projections and just some of the modeling that's been done with some of our biologists like Jennifer Selfridge and Dana Limpert, essentially, it looks like most of Maryland, if we continue on our progression with our climate, it's not going to be habitable by Baltimore checker spots. And so it's a species that we're at the southern extent of its range and that we might lose from Maryland. If you are close to a population and you want to try to put out white turtlehead for it, you certainly can. But the chances of you getting it and attracting it are pretty low. What we're trying to do at the state level is support some projects with partners like the Susquehannock Wildlife Society. They're trying to do some projects with Baltimore checker spots in areas where they are naturally occurring, and essentially putting more white turtlehead out and other host plants and trying to protect them from deer. So if you want to help them out, then potentially look into helping out Susquehannock Wildlife Society or some of our other partners with those projects.
Janice asks, I inherited a number of plants that came with the property. Is there a way to identify cultivars? She has viburnums, but she's not sure if they're native.
Yeah, so in terms of identifying whether it's native or non-native, there are a lot of really cool tools now with your phones. So you can get things like Plant Snap or Picture This, or iNaturalist is a really good one. And that will help you with identification. Figuring out, whether or not it's a cultivar is a bit harder. And so for some of my plants, I've actually have cultivars planted in my yard because early in my days of planting, those were the things that were available. So I know some of them are cultivars because the coloration of the leaves and or the flowers are different from the natural plants. So if you identify the plant and you know that, hey, this is a beard tongue, right? And then you look at the pictures of the local beard tongue and you see that the leaves or the flowers are very off or different, it's potential that you could have a cultivar there.
One more question. Doug Talamy has a list of small oaks. Perhaps oaks are not only for large yards anymore. Do you have any experience with these smaller oaks?
I do not. So I have not planted any oaks myself. I have wild chestnut oaks that grow in my yard and white oaks. So I'm very fortunate already to have thriving oaks in my yard. And yeah, and Doug Talamy just came out with a new book all about oaks. And so he would definitely be an excellent resource to look into and learn more about some of the oaks and his research with that.
We are way over time, so I think we're going to call it a night. But thank you very much for your patience and your great answers to all of these questions. Apologies to those of you whose questions we did not get to. And thank you everyone for your interest and for attending.
Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening and feel free to reach out if you have any more questions.
Okay.
And thank you to the Maryland Native Plants Society for hosting this presentation.